Well, hello. Thank you for joining today. We've got a really fun show today, talking to one of the members in our Platonic Path group, Giioke Arturo. And really, we're going to be talking about the cool project that he's working on at the moment that is going to be a big part of what we're doing at Platonic Path as far as our sort of religious side of things go and defining really what like a Platonic liturgy looks like, a Platonic worship service. And that's really something that Giyoki here has gone ahead and kind of taken the helm with and created his own Platonic worship service that's out online on podcast. So something I want to talk with him about and talk about kind of the future of how Platonic Path is going to handle some of the things like this liturgy stuff as well. So welcome, Giyoki. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you, Eric. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So I hope I gave an okay introduction of what you're working on and what your project's all about. But maybe in your own words, you could kind of let us know what it is that you're working on.
Sure. Yeah, the podcast itself is called Threshold of the Cave, and really, uh, it was created as a Platonic worship service. Uh, it's a fairly short. Any particular episodes, maybe about 20 minutes to a half an hour long, meant to kind of facilitate Platonic worship in the everyday for um, the average human being. Uh, And really the project began as uh, a tool for my own use, because coming from a background where I had never really been very religiously oriented for most of my life, coming into the Platonic religious space with nothing on hand was a little bit like walking through the dark. So I had been essentially uh, praying in this way for a good month or two before I really decided, this is a really good uh, skeleton for something that
Mhm.
I could share with others. And that's the birth of Threshold of the Cave.
Yeah. So how much have you done so far? I think you just started last month with it. We're starting with sort of Dionysia. Was that the beginning of it?
Yes. So we ended up, I say we, it's in royal we, but I started the Threshold of the Cave starting January 1st, halfway ish through the 12 days of Dionysus, um, beginning with his birth through the Thigh of Jove, and have continued on through the rest of the 12 days of Dionysus. Um, Mostly focused on the service mostly focuses on the nuns, kalends, and ides of every month, and it's meant to uh, facilitate worship uh, in that particular direction. I would say. Um,
Yeah, and maybe we should explain for some. I think some people are going to be familiar with the Nones, Calends, Ides kind of structure of the month, but I'm sure some people don't necessarily know what that is. So could you give us a little background on that?
sure. It's my understanding the splitting up of the month into kalends, nuns, and ides is something that's traditionally Roman, where they would essentially mark out the different phases of the moon during the calendar, because the Roman calendar itself was a lunisolar calendar. Um, so calends would be the first of the month. I believe it's the nuns is the quarter moon, and the ides I believe is the half moon. Um, I'm not entirely 100% on all of the specifics quite yet. Still kind of getting a hang of it. But what really ends up helping is my wife is Catholic, and the Catholics also go by a calends, nuns, and ides kind of calendar that they use from time to time.
Yeah, that's kind of where I got introduced to it, and a mixture of Gemistus Plethon, and he's got more that kind of lunar calendar that he uses in the liturgy that he makes. Um, and I noticed that same structure when I started looking at Catholic missals. So
Hmm.
missals meaning like the structure of the mass throughout the year, and they're kind of books that you follow along with the mass. If you looked at the calendars in there, I noticed these little red marks in the calendar where on the first of every month it would say Cal, CAL, and then it would say nones like NON, and then they would have Ides as well. And so I just thought that was fascinating that this is this really old part of the Roman calendar that has carried forward to today through the Catholic Church. That's been around for long before the Catholic Church. This is really old Roman pagan calendar stuff. When Julius Caesar had redone the calendar, uh, all of that would have been there then. And
Hmm.
really, there hasn't been a ton of change. We often refer to the calendar that we use today as the Gregorian calendar, and it is, but the Gregorian changes were kind of these minor changes that happened because of a miscalculation in the Julian calendar. So the Julian calendar was just a little bit off. And so after I think about 1,000 years, they were off by I think it was 10 days. It might have been more than that, but they got off the calendar by quite a bit. And so it kind of shifted the whole year. And so that's where we got, I want to say the leap year came from them, was this little if we add this day every 4 years, everything balanced out and worked out. So that was really the big innovation with the Gregorian calendar. But otherwise, everything else has remained pretty much the same since Julius Caesar, which is really wild.
Yeah, and most people will understand or at least recognize Ides from the Ides of March,
Hmm.
which is when Julius Caesar was assassinated. But usually, people don't tend to associate themselves with the Ides, Nones, or Calends in every day, which is a bit of a shame because it's a really nice way to structure a month.
Yeah, I agree. When I was doing the Plato's liturgy, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed. And we're on a solar calendar anyways at this point, so the calends comes around and it's not necessarily aligned with that moon cycle, but I did do the moon cycle thing for a little bit, and it's really cool because on the calends, it's always the new moon. And I think in Greek, they just call the calends pneumenia, which means new moon. And then when you get to the Ides, that would be the full moon. And then it goes back into the new moon, right? So you're always aware of those cycles. And, when you see the moon, it actually starts to take on this very calendar like meaning to you because you kind of get a sense of where you are in the month because of where the moon is. And it's a shame that we kind of have lost sight of that, but I don't know if there's any easy way to kind of jump back into that. I know some people really like their lunar calendars, but um, as a society, we obviously don't really follow that, but would be cool if we did.
Oh,
Um,
agreed.
but I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you really came to all of this, and you were talking about it a little bit that when you got into Platonism, it was a little bit overwhelming as far as trying to figure out what that worship service or what ritual is going to look like. And I think that's a really common issue that a lot of people have. I have a lot of people ask me about rituals that they can do, and they asking a lot about kind of how practice works and things like that. And so it sounds like this was kind of coming out of an exploration of that for you. Is that right?
That's right. So just to reiterate, most of my life I had been religiously interested, but not religiously practicing. So when I had come into Platonism, of course, I was initially kind of sidelined into sort of understanding the terminology, understanding the thought behind Platonism. But when it came to practice, um, other than your very wonderful book, Ascesis, there was nothing else really around that was catering to the needs that I had had. I had this. Uh, I had this internal feeling about what religion was supposed to look like and what it was supposed to feel like that was coming from absolutely no real place. So when I sat down to actually create a practice for myself, I ended up coming up with a skeleton of, obviously, Vesta uh, is prayed to at the beginning and end of everything that we do. And then you would honestly then move on towards the worship of the particular deity of that day or that month. And then you would have another prayer to whoever governed over, whether it was the Calends, the Nuns, or the Ides, and then it went from there, including things like thinking back to my experiences with going to church with my wife, and thinking back on the fact that the priest usually had some sort of uh, reading from the Bible, or they would talk about what was going on in their community. And I added a little bit of that, which also very much so helped me further my reading of Plato and the Platonic dialogues, which helped me personally a lot. And so when it came to actually putting the podcast together, I had most of it ready to go. Uh, the only things that I think that I really added was, rather than meditating, what I would do is I would meditate in silence at the beginning, and then I would go through the prayers to Vesta, the prayers to the deities of the day, of the month, read, and then end in silence and get up afterwards. I ended up adding the prayer to the one in silence at the end of the podcast service. That way it would kind of round it out and take us through um, the path from generation back up to the one in a symbolic way.
That's very cool. And I did notice that kind of Roman structure to everything that you were doing. One of the books that I recommend for a lot of people who were asking me about ritual was the Religio Romana handbook,
Hmm.
which I think is maybe associated with Nova Roma. I'm not sure. I think they some association with those guys, but it's a great book, and they did a ton of research for it, and it's all very grounded in primary sources and pulling from those. And then they obviously have to do a little bit of work to kind of flesh everything out, but it seemed very, very authentic, and a lot of research and work went into it. And so, was that an influence on you for this? Because it seemed, at least to me, that it had a kind of reflection of that, even though it's definitely distinct in its own thing.
Yeah, the Nova Ramona handbook, I believe, is by the Nova Roma organization, who
Hmm.
I believe they are somewhat religious, but they're mostly a reenactment group.
Hmm.
I have access to the Religio Romana handbook that they ended up creating, and it was a bit of an inspiration, especially in terms of like their list of gods is just phenomenal.
Hmm.
Their description of the different holidays that they incorporated into their own practice is phenomenal. Um, but really, what I was looking towards was my experience in seeing religion practiced in front of me, and
Hmm.
then just kind of going with the Platonic ideal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I like that approach more than obviously the pure sort of historical reenactment kind of version of things. Religion has to be kind of a lived thing. It has to be this thing that we actively participate in, that really moves us. I don't think it can just be dry ritual, just for the sake of it being super old.
Hmm.
And that's something that I think you've really struck the balance with in putting this together. It's they're great services to watch and to even participate in as like as a weekly practice. Basically, you can kind of open that up, and when there's a particular holiday, feel like you're going through all of it, and there's even a space that you put in there so that people can do their own offerings at their own altars and things like that while they're going through it. And so I love that sort of structure all built into it. And I think if you were just going for purely matching the historical references or something like that, you wouldn't really have the space for that necessarily.
Yeah, agreed. And that's one of the reasons why I liked to keep it within that half-hour frame.
Hmm.
Just thinking about the average person today, whether or not they really want to worship using this method, they're probably going to be pretty busy, even if it's on a weekend day. If any of the episodes that come out, let's say, even if it's on a weekend day, they might have kids to take care of. They might have their chores to do. Some people are probably even working on weekends, God's forbid. Um, so I felt like that was a really necessary part, especially in the modern day, because back in the day, back in ancient Rome, or really any time beyond the modern day, you didn't really have a work schedule necessarily. You operated uh, basically due to what season it was, and you were, you know, working by looking at the moon and figuring out what day of the month it was via the moon. So I just felt like people were really yearning for some kind of practice to, not feel like they were going to a Renaissance fair or something like that when they decided to don the robes and go out with their wizard stick and start shouting
Mm.
at the moon. So
Yeah.
I feel fairly satisfied in that a lot of people have really enjoyed the service so far, and it has brought a decent handful of people to practice more often, which was the goal.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, that was a huge influence for me putting esquisses together for everyone because I noticed the exact same thing. It's like there's this great philosophy in Platonism, and it can be so technical and deep. And I think that depth is what makes it so rich. But at the same time, there's always that question of like, okay, well, how do I actually do it? Right? Like, how do I actually do Platonism, not
Hmm.
just think about it or read books about it? And this is one of those missing pieces. For me, I thought about it in more of kind of even a personal practice kind of level. But what I love about this is it's really taking more of a group approach to it. And that's been, big reason why we partnered up on this is that, the first time I saw it, it like a light bulb went off in my head. And I realized this is really what can be the center point for Platonic practice moving forward from a community standpoint. There's always going to be the personal prayer, the meditation and contemplation type practices, but to be able to get together with a group of people and have a set sort of liturgy to work off of is hugely important. I mean, that's really how you build community is through these shared practices and shared activities together. So, and on that point, I was thinking about holidays. You were mentioning kind of Roman holidays and things like that, and I'm kind of curious to hear how your outlook on the holidays is.
Yeah, as that was actually something I wanted to talk about too, because through the creation of this worship service, I've actually really been able to dive into the way that we can celebrate these holidays in the modern day. I mean, just thinking back to the recent series that I did on the 12 days of the Dionysia, something that I didn't know beforehand was about the epic poem, the Dionysica,
Hmm.
and it's the entire story of Dionysus's birth, death, rebirth, and ascent,
Hmm.
and it's just absolutely packed with all of this excellent information. It was written by a Christian, I believe, in the third century, but he was also clearly connected to the uh, the Dionysiac cult. Um, and it was fascinating for me to go day by day through the 12 days of Dionysia and really take a look at uh, the different phases of the life of Dionysus and what it meant on each of those days. And then moving forward to other holidays too. I feel like the way that I was planning on handling holidays moving forward was taking a little bit of the traditional on one hand and the modern on the other hand and trying to rub them together to
Yeah.
create something that the average person today can really resonate with and really practice without having to learn a bunch of new words or without having to, once again, put on their Ren Fair costume and shake their magician's stick at the sky.
Yeah.
And, I've been working on a little bit of that. I did initially post a explanation of the 12 days of the Dionysia on my Substack, and I'm
Hmm.
planning to do much the same, where am essentially going to be laying out all of the different holidays that the podcast specifically is going to go through.
Hmm.
Um, and hopefully that'll also help other people kind of structure their own individual worship as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree. The incorporation of the Dionysica into the worship service was great. Throughout those different days of the holidays, you were taking different parts of the myth of Zagreus, Dionysus Zagreus, and explaining it as you went along. And I just really loved that. And that is such an incredible book that so few people really know about. Maybe because it happened so late, like you said, it's fifth
Hmm.
century, but it's the longest epic poem that we have to today. It's longer than the Odyssey, the Iliad. It's longer than the Aeneid. It's longer than all of them. It's a huge work,
Yeah.
and I've even heard too that Nonus, he sometimes people will say that he might be a Christian because there's another work attributed to Nonus that's a commentary on the Gospel of John, I think.
Yes.
And but there's some debate over did he write the commentary on the Gospel of John first and then he wrote the Dionysica later, or is it the other way around? And so I think there's some debate about, whether he was kind of a pagan figure who turned to Christianity, or if he was a Christian figure who went back to paganism. So a little debate there that I'm sure we'll never get a perfect answer for, but just something interesting to think about.
Yeah, one of those mysteries of history. And yeah, just to be clear, Nonus is the author of the Dionysica. Thank you for pointing that out. I should have mentioned that earlier. Um, but yeah, and in terms of the other holidays, it's much going to be much the same. Trying to find ritual poetry, and sticking to the Orphic hymns and the Homeric hymns, and really trying to like tease those out over the course of the different holidays is the big plan. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the time people are going to be coming to the Platonic path, especially even the Romanist form of the Platonic worship, and not really know how to orient themselves. And that's really what that's about, especially even as we move on to create a weekly liturgy, because, you know, that's another thing that you had mentioned, this being a way to weekly practice and worship with one another. The way that the podcast does it is clearly oriented towards that sort of medium, that podcast medium. But ultimately, the goal would be to create that liturgy that could be done weekly on a
Mhm.
set day so that an entire community can come together and worship with one another. So
Yeah.
hopefully
And that
all of
just
those
makes sense.
resources. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems to make sense with just the way modern life works.
Hmm.
I love the Calends, the Ides, and the Nones, and all of that. But obviously, if you're operating on those, the first and the 15th of the month, which correspond with the Calends and Ides, it's going to be a different day every week. It
Right.
could be Tuesday once, and then it's Friday, and then it's Wednesday. So it'd be a little difficult, I think, for most people to kind of work around that. Hopefully we get our own buildings, and maybe it starts to make more sense to do that. But it's still a little difficult, I think, with people's lives to have that kind of irregularity. Um, but yeah,
Right.
I think regardless, having that kind of worship service, however it is, weekly or otherwise, is essential to the kind of building of community. And I kind of want to touch back on the holidays part that we were talking about,
Yes.
just because you had you have this kind of blending that you're doing. So it's not necessarily going to take the ancient Roman holidays as they were exactly, like Lupercalia or whatnot, and just hey, here's Lupercalia or here's Bacchanalia. These kind of ancient Roman holidays, you kind of had a way of working it into a more modern setting.
Yeah, yeah. So let's take Lupercalia as an example. Today, what we would celebrate here in America on the date of traditional Lupercalia would be Valentine's Day.
Hmm.
Obviously, Valentine's Day, named for Saint Valentine or Saint Valentin, um, who really we don't tend to venerate. I mean, he was a very notable figure in his own religion, but uh, that's not who we're here to celebrate in our own worship. And then thinking back on, Lupercalia, if I come up to somebody random on the street and I say, oh, well, happy Lupercalia, it's probably going to get me a weird stare. But if I say something like, oh, happy Cupid's Day, they can
Right.
relate that Cupid is a daemon of love and, in association with Venus. And, that leads right into Valentine's Day cards, hearts, candies, the same kind of way that we would tend to celebrate today. Yeah. Depending on the community, that might be worshipped a little bit differently, but at least when we're communicating one to one with one another, if I say Cupid's Day, you immediately know what that means. In the same way for things like, and apologies for my pronunciations here, is one of the reasons why I've personally advocated for renaming a couple of these.
Hmm.
Magasia, the
I think it's Megalesia.
Megalesia, thank you. Yeah, and that's essentially Mother's Day. And
Hmm.
all we really add to that is appreciating not only our mothers in our uh that are currently with us, but also our grandmothers and all of our other female familial bonds that keep us together and brought us here today. So the holidays would essentially be following that kind of a pattern.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good way to do it because even when you look at the Christians, people often mention this that the Christians didn't necessarily change every single holiday. And every year we have this whole argument that erupts over is Christmas pagan or not.
Oh
And
yeah,
of course the Christians are, oh no, it's totally Christian, and the pagans, no, it's totally pagan. It's just Yule rebranded. And the reality is somewhere in the middle there. I think it's like there's certainly parts of Christmas that are totally Christian, and there are these parts of it that are pagan, and it's a blend between the two. And part of the genius of Christians was to not throw out these holidays and not throw out traditions like what goes on Saturnalia, and they didn't throw out what Yule was as a holiday. They just found a way to incorporate it into what they're doing. Sometimes they'll use the term baptize for that. They kind of baptize those traditions and make them Christian in their own way.
right.
And I kind of see us having an opportunity with that now where most of our calendar at this point is secular anyways. If you're talking about Valentine's Day or St. Patrick's Day, Independence Day, Thanksgiving, especially the American holidays, it's like these aren't necessarily religious in tone, but they actually structure the year for us. And it makes sense to sort of divinize them, theologize them, so to speak.
Right, right. Which leads me on to another holiday that I've been really looking forward to really writing about, which is Columbia's Day, which for us in the United States of America would be 4th of July. And Columbia is the goddess and personification of the United States of America. And the way that I've been thinking about it in my head, and it's not quite official at this point, but um, I'm really leaning on Columbia's Day, not only celebrating Columbia in and of herself, but also her sisters, Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, and their mother Ceres, the goddess of abundance and of the earth. So, with that being said, a lot of these religious holiday uh, I guess I'd say remountings don't really involve a lot of changes in terms of how we celebrate in our modern day. For instance, on Columbia's Day, we would still light fireworks. We still celebrate our country. We still think about and honor the people who have fought and defended our country, fought for our values and things like that. Um, for Mother's Day, we're still honoring our mothers. We're still honoring our grandmothers. We're still looking back at the matriarch, the feminine line of our families, and really honoring and thinking really hard about how they might have struggled or the different lessons that they've lent us on their way through life. I think that makes it very special.
Yeah, I agree. And, when you look at pagan antiquity and the way that they handled holidays, there's a very public and civic component to all of it. These weren't holidays that were just happening in your house or, a private kind of affair. They involved the greater society. And, it's great to be able to take the ones that we already have that we're already celebrating that are already a part of our lives and then saying like you've pointed out, like, hey, there's a goddess associated with this one. It's easy to make that transition and say, let's divinize this, let's theologize it, let's make it about our religious practice as well. So it's not just a secular holiday anymore, it becomes a religious holiday as well.
Exactly, exactly. And that brings me back to the Dionysia, where, you know, a lot of the time when I'm looking at a holiday, especially for the worship service, um, a lot of the times I might not rename a holiday because it's just so appropriate. You
Mhm.
know, the Dionysia was traditionally celebrated as the Dionysia, and it's really a focus on Dionysus. So why would you take that away? Why would you try to rename something like that? I mean,
Right.
you do obviously have the Christian 12 days of Christmas, which
Mhm.
obviously has a bit of a ring to it. And there's also 12 days of the Dionysia. So really, it's just a sprinkling of a bit of a modern twist to it. But,
Mhm.
not all holidays really need that kind of workover. A lot of them are perfectly fine the way that they are. But in terms of a lot of the more obscure holidays that many people don't really know that much about, who aren't like glued to history books or super
Mhm.
nerdy about it, I feel like rebrandings like that are very useful.
Yeah. Well, and I've also noticed there was a lot of success in the heathen communities in doing essentially the same thing that you're talking about, where, it seemed like they took the wheel of the year, the kind of pagan, Wiccan, generic kind of wheel of the year idea that really focuses on the solstices and the equinoxes. And they use that as sort of the skeleton to build the year off of. And they did add some of these other holidays that were unique to them, like Yule, obviously, or Winter Nights was another one.
Mhm.
Midsummer, which I think Midsummer aligns with the summer solstice, but either way, they added a couple of those throughout the year. Easter, I think they kept. They might pronounce it differently, but more or less, it's kind of around that same time. And so, that seems to me to be like a really smart framework, and has been really successful for them. And I think we forget sometimes that calendar that they made is not necessarily identical to what was done in antiquity or the Vikings or whatever else. Like, it is kind of a modern creation. It's a mixture of the old and the new. And I think you kind of need that to move forward. You can't really just be so focused on matching what was done in the past. We need to do something that merges these two worlds together, that's rooted in the ancient, but actually addresses the real religious and spiritual and civic needs that we have today.
Agreed. I mean, it's very difficult for especially somebody practicing a religion that honestly hasn't had any adherents for nigh 1,000 years to walk backwards in time. That's impossible.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people who are really interested in the revival of these paths really get bogged down with the historicity of it all and trying to be as accurate as possible. I mean, sure, for some, that may be what really drives them, gets them up in the morning to actually do it, to bring honors back to these traditions that have essentially been um, thrown to the side and really admonished for such a long time. Admonished may be the wrong word, but um, degraded is probably what I was looking for. Um, but at the end of the day, in the modern day, you can't always do that. You can't walk back in time. It is kind of sad that a lot of these traditions were essentially lost to us. But if we spend all of our time looking backwards, we're just going to be walking backwards without being able to see what's ahead. And I think that that's a huge opportunity lost.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you see that sometimes in some groups that are maybe more reconstruction focused. There's sort of like it's almost like they have an anchor attached to them, and it's like I understand that desire to not want to just make stuff up and go off the rails, and you can certainly go too far in the other direction where there's no anchor at all, and you just kind of fly off and do your own thing, and it's not tied to anything that's ever been done before. There's no tradition to it. There's no, depth to it. But there is that other extreme where you become so almost like litigious about following it as this like letter of the law, like, oh, if I can't find it in an old ancient source, well, then we can't do it because we just don't have enough of this ancient information to do it. I've always just found that very limiting. That we're never going to find everything that we want from the past, right? Where there is stuff that's missing and genuinely missing, and
Mhm.
further, I think religion just has to address us as people today, where what we have addressed the spiritual needs of a culture that's frankly long gone. Especially when we look at the old Roman stuff, so much of that was tied to the Roman agricultural year and the way that them as a people understood themselves and how they
Hmm.
celebrated things. And that doesn't always reflect who we are anymore. There's a gap there that we can't bridge just purely by imitation. And sometimes I think about it in terms of I relate it to Christianity. Like, even if you were a Christian today and wanted to be a Christian, you don't enter the tradition by going and looking at first century Christian sources and then trying to mimic what Christians in the first century were doing. Because really, what they were doing 2,000 years ago is very different than what we're doing today because times have changed, the church has changed, the people have changed, and these traditions have evolved and grown with them. And so, it's not enough to just copy what was done. You have to kind of live in the world while keeping that in your mind at the same time.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of examples of that elsewhere as well. Like Zoroastrianism isn't worshipped to the exact degree that it used to be in Zoroaster's own time.
Mhm.
Um, you also have a lot of the Sanatana Dharma practices that aren't exactly the way that they were when those sacred texts were written themselves. And then you can even look at the occult traditions that we have today, like the Solomonic traditions. Who on this wide earth is able to get themselves a leopard skin belt in today's day
Right.
and age through post, nonetheless, through
Yeah.
post? So I feel like it's only natural for all of these things to kind of evolve and change, especially, to get platonic about it. We're in the realm of generation. Things are constantly going to change and
Mhm.
mix. Nothing is going to be eternal here. So the best that we can do really is try to find what is eternal in these practices and hang on to that and allow everything to shift and move around us as much as we can. That's probably the healthiest way to look about it.
Yeah. That's the thing I've always loved about the Platonic outlook to these things is we're always trying to get at the heart of something and get to the truth of something. And, the particulars can change a little bit. And, that doesn't mean we go and just do whatever we want. It's like we're grounded in this truth, in this deeper truth, this sort of logos that's behind things. But how it expresses itself in the particular, there's some leeway there, and that allows us to, I think, not just be, reconstructionists where we're trying to revive a religion that's died or been dead or is on life support or whatever, um, but it more so allows us to sort of tap into this vein and really have a living tradition that is essentially immortal. It's eternal. It can't die.
Agreed, 100%. And I think that's one of the bigger strengths of what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to bulldoze over reconstructionists and,
No.
try to tell them how they should necessarily worship because clearly uh, they're doing a bang up job
Mhm.
doing it the way that they're doing it. It's just that, you know, I personally, and it would seem that we at the Platonic Path, we're trying to loosen it up a little bit and try to modernize it to a degree where it's accessible to a
Mhm.
lot of different people. Try to, we don't want to necessarily gravitate towards the broadest possible recognition because then you end up doing things like cutting corners, and we definitely don't want to do that.
Right.
But we definitely want to be able to bring this type of worship to the people who really want to be able to do it, but maybe they don't have, a leopard skinned pelt belt, so to
Sure.
speak.
Or they're not ready to wear a toga or something like that and,
Right. No
down their
shaking of
sandals.
staves to the sky. So
Right. Yeah, there's a balance point there for sure. So, why don't you let us know just a little bit about the service itself and how it works and, sort of what's included in it?
sure. So when the threshold of the cave service opens up, normally I'll greet everybody on the podcast and flow straight into a hymn to Vesta. Traditionally speaking, Vesta is usually called upon at the beginning and the end of every traditional service, at least since the ancient times. Here, we're mostly just calling her in order to purify the space, purify ourselves, get ourselves ready for that state of worship. After that, normally what we'll do is we'll slide into a moral reading. That's going to be either a passage from Solustius, Epictetus, Pythagoras, or even just going over things like the virtues and just allowing that to purify us further. And then after we've purified ourselves, we've refocused on the virtues, or we've taken to heart the sayings of Epictetus or Pythagoras, we'll go straight into a hymn to a particular god. Usually that god will change based on the month and what day the podcast episode is coming out, whether that's the Calends, the Nuns, or the Ides. And from there, we'll go over a little bit of a Platonic myth, or maybe we'll take an excerpt out of the Platonic dialogues, or read through that excerpt. And then after the excerpt, we'll take some time to sit down and explain what's going on in the excerpt, why it matters, what the theming is for that particular day. One of the best examples for this is probably from the 12 days of the Dionysia, where each particular day of the Dionysia is based off of a particular theme. So, for instance, when the Titans rip off the limbs of Zagreus and cast him into the world of generation, we talk about how uh, we ourselves are part of Dionysus, uh, and also part Titan, and what this means for us, and how we can essentially collect the divine within ourselves and move forward. Usually a passage like that is going to take a couple of minutes to read. We go over it and explain it based off the theming. And then from there, we will have some time for making prayers. The libation is what I call it. So we'll call on people to do any of the libations or prayers that they want to do in their own time. This is a perfect time to stop or pause the podcast, light some incense, get some mead or wine poured out into a, a, a cup for this particular purpose. Definitely don't recommend doing this with a regular glass. Definitely something that's been consecrated for this purpose. And then make an offering to the gods, say a prayer of your own. And then from there, once that libation is done and you return, we'll do a mandatory 30 seconds of silence. And I know that a lot of people who tend to listen to podcasts, if they hear, oh, there's the 30 seconds of silence in this podcast, I do really implore people to stick with the 30 seconds. Leave the podcast on, sit
Mhm.
with it in silence, close your eyes, really come to stillness. You're bringing yourself back to the one.
Mhm.
Um, and then after that, usually we'll have a little bit of catch up with, what's going on in the community. Has anybody who's been listening to the service have any questions? We'll go over those questions and answer questions that the community has. And that's pretty much it. We
Mhm.
take you from a purification through the morals into the particular divinities of that particular time, really bring them closer to you, and then work through your particular interests in that particular time with libations, and then bringing it all back up to the one.
That's great. And, I've had so many people ask me since I mentioned Platonic Path incorporating as a church and us starting a church here in Montana. People ask, okay, well, what does that look like? Like, what does a church service look like? And, you know, what you're doing, that's essentially the answer to that question. Is this is what the Platonic church service essentially looks like. And your work that you're doing here is really going to be the bedrock for how we form the liturgy moving forward. So you talked about some of the readings and some of the myths and things like that that are a part of this. And so do you see this as something where somebody has to know about Platonism and understand it before they show up, or is this something where it kind of guides them through these different ideas?
Excuse me. Yeah, no, you don't need to know anything about Platonism to really get started in this. Really, we're walking you through the different myths of Plato, the different concepts that are involved in the tradition. Um, Really, all we ask is your open heart and your participation in the prayers. So, uh, in terms of what I was saying earlier about when we're opening it up after the hymn to Vesta to the moral readings, that's a real big time to open yourself up to, okay, well, what do we really believe in terms of our moral obligations to not only one another, but to the gods and to the world around us? And usually Epictetus or Pythagoras will have a snippet about, Epictetus is a lot about like your self-worth or your relationship to other people. Or Pythagoras will have a particular comment about your relationship to the gods and what's proper to them. And then especially going through the virtues, how do we hold ourselves? How do we think about ourselves? What are the things that we're trying to cultivate in ourselves? And we'll also guide you through the Platonic corpus in terms of, if you want to read the Platonic corpus from end to end, absolutely. Go do that. 100%. But this is a way for you to get your bite-sized chunks, the myth of the ring of Gyges, the chariot, the myth of the cave itself, which the podcast is actually named after. These will essentially give you the bulk of what Platonism is about, what it's essentially trying to teach, and its relationship to you and your relationship to the divine.
That's great. And I think it's so easy for people to think that Platonism is this purely intellectual exercise. It's something for the kind of bookworm types. And I think part of that is just because there is so much depth there and there are so many books, and reading Plato's not easy, to say nothing of the later Platonists like Plotinus and Iamblichus, Proclus, all of them. it
Yeah.
it requires a lot to understand what's going on there, and so it tends to attract the type of person who loves to dive into, a really big intellectual endeavor to try to understand the whole thing from end to end. But at the same time, from a practice standpoint, like you're saying, so much of what we're really talking about from a day-to-day practical viewpoint is things like cultivating virtues. It's things like bettering ourselves and figuring out how to properly connect to the cosmos and find sort of our place within the cosmos. And, those things are not something that you have to read a million books to understand. In fact, the books might actually be a hindrance to that in
Yeah.
some sense. You can over intellectualize your spirituality to a point where you become a little disconnected from just the boots on the ground stuff. And so that's one of the things I love about this is it's kind of a return to form. It's a return to the nuts and bolts of what Platonism and just Greek philosophy in general is getting at. When the philosophers talk about philosophy, they don't talk about it as just being this academic or scholastic type of thing where we have to go, study and do deep exegesis on the text all day long. When they talk about it, they say it's preparation for death.
Yeah.
It's preparation for the soul. It's about the ascent of the soul and attaining likeness with God. That's the goal. And, hopefully the books can help you there if that's something that you need. And I do really believe that for a lot of people who have a difficult relationship with God, maybe is a one way to put it, where, maybe they've been burned by Christianity and their idea of what God is still very bound up in this Old Testament Yahweh, divine command kind of version of God. Though the reading the Platonic works can really help break that spell and help people to realize that God is something much bigger and much greater than, some spiteful deity from the Middle East. And that's a good thing. I'm glad all of that's there. But at the same time, I think we can't ever lose sight of actually doing it,
Hmm.
cultivating that virtue and bringing this stuff about in our own lives.
That's another thing that I really was attracted to about the Platonic tradition as a whole. You mentioned Plotinus and Proclus, who essentially are beacons of different ways to really dive into the tradition and really practice it. Proclus was very inspired by geometric proofs. So he has a very complex system and a very complex hierarchy of who you pray to when, and who's in charge of what. But Plotinus, he was more of a contemplative stillness. Bringing yourself to the one, the alone to the alone. That's just absolutely beautiful.
Hmm.
So there's no real one way to practice this. And I would definitely implore people who are listening to Threshold of the Cave to, don't think that when you're listening to Threshold of the Cave that this is the way that it has to be done. Platonists from the more ancient times all had their own unique ways of coming to the one themselves, and uh, allowing that to flourish within you and finding your own way to really participate in this is really key, because at the end of the day, you and God and the gods are the ones really participating and coming to each other in this. And that's really what has to be held special.
Absolutely. And that is something that is really unique about Platonism than you see in some other natural religions, but it's a stark contrast to Christianity, where Christianity is much more of a narrow path. I think Jesus even says that at some point. There's this very narrow path of a particular way to God, and in Platonism, the object that we're going for, it's like we're all moving toward God and imitating the gods in the process, but that doesn't mean that the way that we all get there is the exact same. And
Right.
this even goes back to Plato and the Phaedrus, and him talking about us following our leader gods, and our leader gods are not all the same. And so it's like our goal is to align our souls to that divine soul that's most like us. And so, at the core of that is just this idea that the truth is one, the objective that we're going towards is one. We're not relativists by any means, but we do recognize that we don't all come to God and religion and spirituality the same way. And even within the Platonic tradition, we see that. Like you said, if you're talking about Iamblichus and Proclus, they were much more into that kind of theurgy, and it's a very specific, ornate, and complex system of ritual worship that they did. But then you've got people like Porphyry and Plotinus who were much more focused on stillness and silent contemplation and prayer. That was their main focus. And even going back to Plato, Plato really stressed so much of civic worship, like actually doing the civic public worship and being a part of the public rites as being essential to the formation of the soul. So there's all these different parts of it, and we can take even bits and pieces from all of them in our journey as we figure this out.
Yeah, I agree. And, this can be applied to a lot of different ways to explore the Platonic path, TM. But uh, for example, the threshold of the cave is very Roman. It's very
Hmm.
Roman inspired. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, America as a culture is very Roman inspired. A lot of our founders were very Roman oriented. They read a lot of the great Roman orators and statesmen of, yesteryear. And, that's really how America ended up being fleshed out. A lot of our buildings are even Roman in style. But that doesn't have to stop there. Platonism is just about the the metaphysical backbone of spirituality itself, I like to think.
Hmm.
So even if you're not interested in a strictly Roman themed, if I could call it themed, style of worship, there are plenty of other ways to do it. I mean, even speaking back to Plotinus, Proclus, and Iamblichus, you really just got to start the work. And I think that's the most important.
Yeah, I agree. Getting started with worship is one of those things that it's so easy when you start to have a million questions and wonder, like, am I doing it right? Is this even the right gods, or am I supposed to be doing something different? Am I doing it wrong? Or are the gods going to be mad at me? That's what a huge question I get all the
Yeah.
time. People are saying, are they mad at me if I do this wrong and stuff like that? And I think that's why it's so beneficial to have something like what you're doing that's kind of like a training wheels a little bit. Like, hey, here's doing it right, and here's something that you can follow along with. And that doesn't mean that if you do it differently, it's wrong, but it just means, hey, here's something that you can actually follow along with and not have to, you know, worry about those particular anxieties, I guess, about am I doing it right? Or did I include all the things I need to include? It kind of gives you a path to follow. I certainly don't expect every single person to go out and create their own liturgy.
Yeah.
It's not an
Yeah.
easy thing to do. So,
Definitely not.
no, it's a huge undertaking, and like I've taken my stab at it, and I found the what you're doing was basically exactly what I had always hoped for, and so I
Yeah.
abdicated and just said, no, Gyoki's going to do this for us, and he's going to be the guy.
Yeah.
Um,
And if
and
I could
it's
say,
yeah,
speaking to the difficulty of it, the last time that this was really attempted to make something that was quote unquote modern and still fit the ancient example was Gemestus Plethon. And that took
hmm
him years to do. And you
hmm
can even, if you go through his works, it's just absolutely saturated with themes of his time. A
hmm
lot of the hymns are just absolutely elongated and verbose. And
you
they're
got the
some of
addresses.
these yeah, oh my god. And some of the services that he recommends take you, like, nigh close to 2 hours.
Sure.
And,
And you're
to
supposed to do them 3 times a day.
he was supposed to do them 3 times a day. Like, he was a man of leisure, so that made a lot of sense to him. He had a lot of time on his hands, but, coming back to the modern day,
Mhm,
we can't necessarily worship like Gemestus Plethon, bless his heart.
mhm.
Um, but yeah,
Well,
it's
and
yeah,
he even had, there's a note in there, I can't remember where it is in it exactly, but there is a point where he mentions that if you don't have time, do it like this. He has these little notes that he put into his liturgy to say, hey, if you're short on time and you can only do this much, then just do this much and move on. So,
yeah.
even for him, I think he was aware that his liturgy was much more of a almost like a monastic type of liturgy, like somebody who had their whole day every day to devote to this could do.
Mhm.
Like you said, a man of leisure. Where today, that's not going to fit. But I think it's important that even for him, there's a recognition that you have to do what you can. And, going with this elongated thing, it's going to take you hours. It's not going to make sense for everybody. We have to adapt things at some level to make them make sense. And even his theology and the way that he constructed everything is an adaptation. He took a very particular perspective about Zeus and who Zeus is, and it's almost a little bit Christianized. I don't want to really accuse him of doing too much of that, but I think there's a level where he wanted to turn Zeus something into the maybe a little more analogous to the Christian god. He couldn't be married, for example. He had to marry Juno to Poseidon to make the whole thing work. So Zeus is all
Yeah.
on his own and stuff like that. So, there's some kooky stuff that he did. But still, I mean, it's incredible that we have that as at least a springboard to show that, like, hey, we know what ancient worship looked like, and we know what this renewed tradition looked like in the 1400s. And then, today we can kind of use all of that as an example to birth what we're doing now.
Yeah, there's no reason that we can't adapt in the same way that Plethon was able to adapt in his day. I mean, hopefully we have a lot more success in it than Plethon did,
Hmm.
having been essentially betrayed by those around him
Yeah.
at the time. But, he made such a great effort into it. And, he's so blessed to have the opportunity to do so. And so are we. And I think that we should really
Hmm.
take that bull by the horns and just work with what we have.
Yeah. And I think we're at a blessed time in history. Bringing up what happened to Plethon, I mean, he had all of his works burned, or most of them. What we have is what didn't get burned. Fortunately, I don't think he ever got killed or executed for it. I think they waited
No.
until he died and to destroy his works. But nonetheless, he was in a time when it was extremely hostile to be doing what he was doing. You got to imagine the
Hmm.
1400s. It was not a time to be an open pagan and
Yeah.
advocating for it. He would say things like, I think in a few hundred years, everyone's going to be pagan and Christianity is going to go away. He was saying things like that at a time when it was really not okay to be saying that and put a, big target on himself for it. And
Yeah.
we're in just such a blessed period of time where religious freedom has really blossomed, and it's kind of our time to take back what really these Platonic sages and teachers have been trying to do for 2000 years. And we finally have our shot where there's really nothing holding us back and there's nothing getting in our way. We just have to have the courage and the confidence to go and do it. And that's exactly what I see you doing with putting this together.
Yeah, I really appreciate you approaching me about making this the liturgy of the Platonic Path, and or at least one of them moving forward. And I really want to take some time to thank you for that, and for the attention that everybody from Platonic Path has really given me. It really meant a lot, and really fueled my fire to do a lot of this. And I want everyone to know, look forward to what we're doing here at Threshold of the Cave. We're going to be posting more stuff on Substack about what the holidays are. I already mentioned that um, we have the explanation of the 12 days of the Dionysia, and there's just more to come. And then another thing, I was talking with somebody else about the service as a whole, and they were asking, what I really need. If I really want to start worship now, and I have
Mhm.
access to Threshold of the Cave, do I need an altar? Do I need statuary, or do I need icons? And my answer, I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, no. All you really need is to have a private space to yourself, or at least some private time to yourself. You can even do this
Mhm.
in the car on your lunch break at work
Mhm.
if you have literally nothing else. And, when we go into the libation, if you don't have incense, or you don't have wine, or you don't have anything like that, let's take the person sitting in their car on their lunch break who just wants to take. We're just trying to facilitate people being able to express themselves religiously. And that's the most important thing that you can take out of Threshold of the Cave. Even if you want to practice in a completely different way, just bring yourself closer to the divine. Think think about how you would like to associate with the power of divinity, and really gravitate towards that.
Yeah, that's perfect. And we definitely don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's much better that you engage in that worship, even if you don't have all the materials and the things. It's like that's all stuff. Like the gods don't need your incense at the end of the day. It's like they're not gonna they're not gonna be hurt or damaged if they don't get it or something like that. And we know that from reading the Platonic sources and what they say about the gods. And the purpose of it is to draw our souls closer to them. And,
Hmm.
you don't need any material object to do that, although they do help as a boon to your own devotion. They can be a great aid to that. But yeah, the
Yeah.
gods are always with you. You don't have to worry about that part. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah,
So,
if you can anchor yourself in yourself to the divinity, you don't need things to anchor yourself, because that's really all it is. They're just anchors to associate with, and
mhm,
you really don't need them. And another thing that I really thought of while we were talking about this is, we're all following the train of uh, our own individual God, who are in themselves circumambulating around the one, so to
mhm,
speak. And just like the celestial divinities, the sublunar deities, they all have their own path around the sun. They all do their own. I mean, they're essentially doing something that's generically similar, where they're circumambulating the sun,
mhm.
but they all do it in their own unique way. So if you really want to think about it in that light, you know, the most important thing is that you're moving in that circle.
Hmm.
You're you're traveling
Right.
around what you believe to be the good, and
Hmm.
just do that.
Yeah. Starting to attach yourself to that which is eternal. Attach yourself to the gods. Move away from these more attachments to the passions and your lower nature and things like that. That doesn't
Hmm.
require stuff. Could quite the
Yeah.
opposite, right? So, well, good. Well, this has been really great. And what we're going to do is put the Threshold of the Cave, a podcast, links up to it on our website, and have a note on there that it is our official liturgy. That is what we're doing as far as our practice goes. And then also a link to your Substack on there as well, where you explain the different holidays and things like that. So people can start to learn about it and even follow along from a worship standpoint. And then, as we get our in person communities together here, that's going to be the main liturgy that we're doing in the in person communities as well. So all of that's going to kind of sync up. So whether you're, on the other side of the world from where we are in our community here, you can still engage in what's going on. And we're going to find more ways to incorporate that as time goes on, maybe even, doing a video service or something at some point. So all that's kind of coming down the pipe. But for now, we'll put this stuff up on the website so you guys can get into it and start to get yourself involved and feel like you're kind of part of the community and starting to do that worship with us.
Yeah, and I would like to the last thing that I would like to say is a thanks to Platonic Path, and especially you, Eric. Thank you for your continued support in this endeavor. And I would just like to let everybody know if you have any questions about Threshold of the Cave. I give the Threshold of the Cave email in the actual podcast, so go check that out. And then, another great way to get more information about this is just visiting the Platonic Path. We're a great bunch of people. We're very friendly. Come on and see us, ask a couple questions. We don't bite.
Yeah, thank you for the plug and thank you for everything that you're doing. You're so welcome for everything, and I just really appreciate all the work that you've put into this because I know how hard it is. I've tried to do it, and this has been one of those things. I realize I can't do everything, and what you've produced is just amazing. So, anybody listening, go check out Threshold of the Cave. Enjoy a service, and if you have any questions, you've got the Platonic Path here and Giioke as well that you can go and reach out to.
Yep. God's bless.
Yep. Thanks, guys.